Hi everyone, it's good to see you this morning. We're being joined by live stream by the University of Sunshine Coast, so hi Sunny Coast people. They've been watching the other two talks on a fairly extensive time delay, but they're probably with us this morning. But I want to say a couple of things to the people in this room before I speak to all of us. One is, mate, stand up. You've been sitting down for a while. Let's stand up and just stretch while I blow some things out that I need to talk about. One is, I just wanted to say, some of you I haven't even said hello to this week, and that's not just because I'm kind of grumpy and all those kind of things. I'm feeling that some of you I haven't even met, people I do know I haven't said hello to, so sorry about that. Please do come and say hello to me. It's not because I don't want to talk to you, I'm just a little bit distracted and things. Okay, you can sit down now. That's one thing. The other thing is, I realised that somehow, in both yesterday's talk and yesterday's question time with the guys, I didn't cover a massive topic that should have been talked about. Apparently in here, the women did talk about it, but in the talk and with the guys, the issue never came up. What about a Christian dating or marrying a non-Christian? Is that okay? Is that a good thing? Is that a wise thing or not? I want to say to you that if you're a Christian and you're seriously thinking about a relationship, a dating relationship or a marriage relationship, of all the people I've spoken to who are Christians who've married non-Christians, not one of them has ever recommended it. Not one of them has ever recommended it as a thing for others to think about, as a thing for others to do. Part of that is because when you're marrying someone, as we saw yesterday, you're becoming one flesh with them. You're joining them in the most profound and deep way. And if you're someone who truly loves Jesus and truly desires to serve Jesus and Jesus is your greatest joy, you're joining yourself to someone who, well, at some level, their life is against Jesus. Hopefully you can see how profoundly incompatible that is. When you're dating, it's kind of easy to kind of avoid that or imagine that somehow it'll work itself out. I've spoken to people who've been married to non-Christians for 5, 10, 15 years. They have children, and it is just a struggle when it doesn't go away. Effectively, every part of your Christian life is like single parenting. If you have kids, getting to church, well, you're the single parent who does that. Helping your kids to grow in Jesus, well, you're a single parent when you're doing that. In terms of your own encouragement and nourishment as a Christian, well, in the marriage, you're on your own. And often, even when the non-Christian person is kind of generous and kind and thoughtful, that is still a struggle. Now, it's a big thing to be thinking about and a big thing to be wrestling with, but I just wanted to make that really kind of clear because I hadn't touched on that yesterday. So yesterday we talked about marriage, today we're talking about singleness. So if you've got your Bible there, 1 Corinthians 7, we'll get to that in a little bit, and your outlines in your booklets there. One of the most memorable weddings that I went to, the Bible reading, was the passage that we have just had read to us. And when the minister got up to address the couple, the first thing he said was, "You've missed out." Now that's kind of weird, isn't it? It's pretty weird to have a passage like that read at a wedding, and it's pretty weird to think about marriage as missing out. Because the reality is, we think that singleness is missing out. Now, our culture is not so into marriage, but it's certainly into sex, and our culture says if you're not getting sex, then you're missing out. And there's a very powerful expectation that even if you're not into casual sexual relationships, you'll have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And if you don't, well, it must be just because you're between relationships, you're just getting ready for the next one. And if you're not actually getting ready for the next relationship and you're not in a relationship, well, what exactly is it that's wrong with you? If you're single, you're missing out. And it's not just the culture out there that kind of peddles that message, that sells that idea that singleness is missing out. Christian culture can do exactly the same thing. Christian culture all too often creates a real sense that if you're single, you're missing out. Family church, family services. And even if you manage to dodge that and you go to night church, all too often there's a feeling that everyone around you is pairing off and I'm not. And what exactly is wrong with me? I'm missing out. And when we see that and when we hear that message all around us, the single life becomes a life of frustration. The single life becomes a life of dissatisfaction. The single life becomes a life of wishing for and wanting for what I haven't got, feeling incomplete, feeling half a person, and longing to be married. Today, I want you to see that singleness is actually so very far from missing out. Today, I want you to see that singleness is not a crazy thing. Singleness actually makes profound sense in the world we live in. More than that, I don't just want you to see that singleness makes sense. I want you to see that singleness is a good thing to be embraced. Like all good things, it has its challenges, but I want you to see how good singleness can be. Now, at this point, some of you may be thinking, Bill, you're a hypocrite. What are you doing, married man, standing up and talking powerfully about the goodness of singleness? What would you actually know? Well, I am very mindful of that. But I'm also very mindful that this morning I come to you, and it's not just me speaking, but I am speaking to you the Word of God. And so I'm not inviting you to trust me, Bill, married 21 years. I'm inviting you to hear and trust the Word of our eternal God as He speaks. I want you to trust God as He says that singleness is a good thing to be embraced. I want you to trust God as He says that singleness is a good thing, and even with its challenges, see how good singleness can be. Before we get there though, I just want to talk very briefly about singleness in the Old Testament. Because in the Old Testament, singleness was missing out. Singleness was a problem. In the Old Testament, singleness is not a good thing. Actually, in the Old Testament, singleness is really not a thing at all. In the pages of the Old Testament, marriage is at the centre stage of God's plans and purposes. Marriage and family are fundamental to maintaining creation. And so Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. That's the kind of the task that God gives to humanity. And well, it's kind of tricky to do that while you're single. And so marriage is at the heart of maintaining and looking after creation. In the Old Testament, marriage and family is also the picture of God's blessing. The sign that you're blessed by God in the Old Testament is that you're married and you have a fruitful family. And so in the book of Deuteronomy, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, God is calling His people to live in obedience to Him. And God says, if you, my people, obey me, then I'll bless you. And He talks about the blessing that He'll give His people in these terms in Deuteronomy 28:11. The Lord will grant you abundant prosperity in the fruit of your womb. That's the first thing. To be married, to have family, it's God's blessing. But if the people don't obey God, Deuteronomy warns that He'll curse them. And see the curse in verse 18. The fruit of your womb will be cursed. A life without marriage and family, it's the curse of God. When you stop and think about it, how many single people are actually described in the law or the histories of the Old Testament? They're pretty much not there, Because in the Old Testament, marriage and family are so central to God's plans and purposes. Marriage and family are the sign of God's blessing. Virtually the only single people who get a mention are widows. Widows who feel themselves under the judgment of God. Marriage and family there is central to God's purposes. But even as you get to the end of the Old Testament, and even as you come to the prophets, something is changing. Something is changing as you get to the prophets. And so I'd encourage you in your free time, we don't have time to look at it now, but to have a look at Isaiah 54 and Isaiah 56. Isaiah 54 and Isaiah 56 announce that a new time is coming. A new time is coming when those who are not married, when those who don't have children will suddenly not be kind of marginal to God's purposes, but they'll stand at the centre of God's purposes. The widow, the one who is not married and doesn't have children, Isaiah 54, and the eunuch, Isaiah 56, the guy who's been castrated, who has no chance for kind of marriage and family. God says these people who were at the margins, these people who were the ones who were cursed by God, well, a time is coming when the single person will find themselves at the centre of God's plans and purposes, at the centre of God's blessing. And that hope, which I'm sorry we don't have time to look at now, that hope points us forward to the pages of the New Testament. It points us forward to the pages of the New Testament. And it points us forward to a time and a place where singleness is not kind of crazy and bizarre and a sign of the curse of God, but singleness is a profound and good thing in God's purposes. Singleness is a profound and good thing in God's purposes because point 2 on your outlines there, singleness is where we are all headed. Singleness is where we are all headed. In Luke chapter 20, Jesus is arguing with the Sadducees about the reality of resurrection. And he tells them in Luke 20, Jesus replied, "The people of this age marry and are given in marriage. But those considered worthy of taking part in the age to come and in the resurrection from the dead, well, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They can no longer die. They're like the angels. They're God's children, since they're children of the resurrection." In the new creation, we'll all be single. We saw yesterday, marriage is a sign. Marriage is a sign that points to the great wedding between God and his people. And when we get there, we will enjoy perfect relationship with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. When we're there, we won't need the sign that points to that reality. You see, I think we tend to think about singleness, that singleness is just a painful, temporary holding pattern until I get married. But the reality is that marriage is the temporary thing we're in before we get single for eternity. If that's where we're all headed, if we're all headed to a life of singleness, if we're all headed to a life where we perfectly enjoy a relationship with God as single people, then singleness now is not a second-rate existence. Singleness now is not missing out. Singleness now is a reminder that all our deepest relational needs and desires will be perfectly met not in a husband or a wife, but in God himself. And yes, in the here and now that will be a struggle. In the here and now that will have its challenges. In the here and now that's not going to work itself out perfectly. But it doesn't in marriage either. Singleness is where we're all headed. Singleness is not a second-rate existence. Singleness is not missing out. The next point about singleness is that singleness makes sense of our time. And here, open again to 1 Corinthians 7 that you've got in front of you. And we're going to dance around 1 Corinthians 7 a bit. We're not going to kind of work our way through it carefully, but there's some things to notice. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 29. 1 Corinthians 7:29. Paul says, "What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not." And he goes on and talks more about that. But Paul says the time we live in, time is short, things are urgent. It's kind of like your parents have gone away for the weekend and they've left you in charge of the house. Party. I mean, socially distanced, of course, but it's great because your parents are away. You don't have to clean up anything. You don't have to do anything. Stuff from the party's still lying around. You haven't washed one single dish from the moment they left because why on earth would you? But then you get a text message from your parents. "We're on our way home." Now, they haven't told you exactly when they're going to be home. They could be 10 minutes away from the door, or it could be 3 hours. But the knowledge that your parents are on their way, that gives urgency and meaning to everything you do. It's time to start cleaning up. And it's definitely not time to make more mess, because that'll just be more stuff that you need to clean up. You don't know when they're going to arrive, but the time that you now live in is a time of urgency. It's a time where there is a particular meaning to everything you do. We live in that time. We live in the time where Jesus is on the way to us and we are on our way to him. And that gives life urgency. You see how Paul talks about it in verse 31. This world in its present form is passing away. What we have now, well, it's on its way out. And that means we don't live as if this is all there is. We don't live as if this is all there is. Look at it in verse 30. Those who mourn live as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Now, Paul's not saying there that we should suppress every emotion that we have. Paul's not saying that we should kind of crunch out our feelings. But what he is saying is that there is something bigger than my sadness now. There's something bigger than my happiness now. A new world is just around the corner. And so I'm not ruled by my emotions or experiences. The same principle is there in the end of verse 30. Those who buy something buy it as if it was not theirs to keep. A new world is just around the corner. So when I buy anything, I'll know that really it's more like I'm just borrowing it. I won't get too attached to it. Verse 31, those who use the things of this world use them as if not engrossed in them, for this world in its present form is passing away. A new world is just around the corner, so I won't get totally absorbed in anything in the here and now. And that principle applies to our relationships. Back in verse 29. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they did not. A new world is just around the corner, so even those who are married should live as if they were not married. Now, Paul's not saying that if you're married, you should ignore your husband and your wife, but what he's saying is there are bigger priorities than marriage. Don't live as if the joys and frustrations of marriage and family are all there are. You can see what he's saying, can't you? If even a married person should kind of live as if there's something much bigger and more profound than marriage, well, singleness kind of makes sense in that world, doesn't it? In his commentary on 1 Corinthians, John Calvin has really helpful things to say. Calvin says this. He says, "For the man or woman who considers that he is a stranger in the world uses the things of the world as if they were another's. That is, as things that are lent to us for a single day. The sum is this, that the mind of a Christian ought not to be taken up with earthly things or to repose in them, that's to rest in them, for we ought to live as if we were every moment about to depart from this life." It's like you're sitting at home, you're waiting for a friend. They're going to come and pick you up at 7 o'clock. It's 10 to 7. They're not here yet, but I've got dressed. I'm kind of ready. Well, what am I going to do now while I'm waiting for them? I don't want to do anything that's going to take too long. I don't want to do anything that's going to be too absorbing. And so I kind of sit there waiting, and I might kind of grab out my phone and scroll through Facebook, or I might do a little bit of tidying. But I'm not going to do anything that fully absorbs me, because I know that at any minute I'm going to have to leave. They're going to rock up and I'm going to have to leave. Singleness makes sense of the time we live in. Singleness recognises that this creation is a momentary gift. Singleness recognises that I don't have to possess every good thing in this creation. Singleness recognises that I don't have to experience every good experience in this creation, because there's a new world just around the corner. Singleness makes sense of the time. Down to point 4 now. Isn't marriage for me lust and loneliness? Because you see, it's easy for us to agree that the theory of singleness is a good thing. The kind of general out there concept of singleness, I can kind of understand it. I can understand why it might be a good thing. And in fact, I can agree why singleness might be a good thing for someone else. But for me, it's a different case. No way. And I think there are 2 big issues that make it really hard for us to think about singleness for ourselves. Those issues are lust and loneliness. The first is lust, or sexual desire. I experience strong sexual desire, therefore I ought to get married. Now, as you read 1 Corinthians, it looks like that's what Paul is saying. You look at verse 8 and 9 there. In chapter 7, verse 8 and 9, Paul says, "To the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it's better to marry than to burn with passion. If I burn with passionate sexual desire, I should get married. If I struggle with lust, I should get married." But did you notice what Paul actually says? Did you notice what he actually says? He doesn't say, if you have passionate sexual desire, you should marry. He doesn't say, if you find sexual self-control difficult, you should marry. What he actually says, if you are not exercising sexual self-control, you should marry. If you're sleeping with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, well, obviously you're unable to exercise self-control. You should get married. But if you're wrestling with sexual desire, that's no sign that singleness is not for you. You see, to wrestle with temptation in sin is a normal part of the Christian life. And so to wrestle with sexual desire is no necessary sign that I should be single. I think we tend to have the idea that there's this gift of singleness that certain magical people have, where lust or anything like that is never an issue for them. That's not the Bible's picture. Now, of course, I need to make it clear, I'm not saying that the only reason you should get married is if you're in immediate danger of sexual sin. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what the Bible's saying. Paul says we're free to marry. But just wrestling with sexual desire is not an automatic indicator that you should not be single. It's important to hear that because it's important to realise that marriage doesn't magically fix the problem of sexual desire and lust. Yes, marriage gives an outlet for sexual desire. A husband and wife's shared passion for one another is a powerful and beautiful thing. But even in marriage, there'll be plenty of times when there's less sex than I desire, or sex is not as exciting or fulfilling as I desire, or somehow I find my desires attached to someone who is not my husband or my wife. And if you haven't learnt to control your desire while you're single, you'll discover that it still controls you while you are married. Marriage doesn't fix lust. Sexual desire is no indicator that I ought to get married. What about loneliness? I feel so dreadfully lonely as a single person. And I look at the marrieds around me and I see the fulfilling relationships they have. To be married, to have someone always with me, that's what I need. Again, the Bible sounds like it speaks that way. You read Genesis 2, and it looks like that's part of God's good design for marriage. Genesis 2:18, the Lord God said, "It's not good for the man to be alone. I'll make a helper suitable for him." And the story goes on, God brings the animals before Adam to see if any of them are suitable helpers. Surprise, surprise, none of them is. And so God makes a woman from Adam's rib. Looks like problem, man is lonely, solution, wife. But did you notice that's not what Genesis is actually saying? God doesn't say it is not good for the man to be lonely. I'll make a companion for him. He says it's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper for him. Adam has just been given the task of subduing and ruling over the world. And God says, in that task, a helper is good. I'll make someone so the man is not alone in the task that I have given him. Marriage is in the service of God. Marriage is not the great antidote to loneliness. Marriage is not the great fix to loneliness. The great antidotes to loneliness are friendship and fellowship, a network of meaningful relationships. Now, I have to say that generally speaking, in recent times, the church has done a shockingly awful job at this. The church used to do a great job of promoting Christian friendship and saying that Christian friendship is as profound and good as marriage. But it seems these days that most of the time the church almost obsessively preaches that marriage can satisfy all your human needs, just about. There's a really helpful book on this that's going to get reviewed on Friday, I think, but I just wanted to read a quick quote from that, talking about the kind of hopes that Christians have often attached to marriage. Families and marriages fail too often because they are trying to answer too many human needs. A spouse is required to be a lover, a friend, a mother, a father, a soulmate, a co-worker, and so on. Few people can be all these things for one person. And when demands are set too high, disappointment can only follow. Now, I'll talk about that more tomorrow as we talk about friendship, but it's important to see at this point that the antidote to loneliness is not marriage. The antidote to loneliness is profound friendship and fellowship. We shouldn't place all our hopes in a relationship with one particular person. We're down to the last point, singleness and single-mindedness. The big point that Paul wants to make, and the big point that God wants to encourage us with, is that singleness provides freedom and focus. Singleness provides freedom and focus. Have a look at verse 32 of 1 Corinthians 7. Paul says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. Paul is saying singleness has a freedom and a focus. It's not a total freedom, but compared to the married person, look at verse 33 and 34. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. If you're married, your interests are always divided. Part of your brain is, how can I grow in Jesus and help others grow? And part of your brain is always thinking about your wife and your family. There's the big picture stuff. What house are we going to live in? What school are the kids going to go to in 2 years' time? My oldest son's going to be at uni, and how are we going to afford that? And do I need to buy another car for him? And when is he going to learn to drive? There's the big picture. There's the immediate as well. Man, I've been busy this week. Pretty much got home, we've had dinner, and then I've sat down at the desk and worked on the talk until all hours. And Linda and the kids, well, they've felt that. I still have to work, but I need to connect to them meaningfully, and how am I going to do that, and what are the kids doing? You see, the brain is always divided. Now, I'm not saying that singleness is entirely free from those issues. You still think about house, you still think about income, you still think about other stuff when you're single. But those issues magically multiply when you're married and when you have kids. The single person has less of those worries. The single person is more able to focus on Jesus and living for him. One of my friends at uni, Gillian, she's currently a missionary in Italy. She's single, and that made certain things easier. It was an easier decision, not an easier decision, but it was an easier decision for her to make the choice to end up in Italy, to be teaching uni students there about Jesus. It was easier because she didn't have to kind of negotiate with what her husband was doing and where he was going, and not just one of them, but both of them. How do they feel about living in Italy and being away from family and friends and parents and things? It was an easier decision to make to get there. And since she's been there, she's had a flexibility that's much easier because she's single. She's moved cities, moved universities for a job. She because of the way the university is set up there, she works lots of nights with the students, kind of outside classes. And those things have just been much easier for her to manage and much easier to cope because she's changing direction for one person, not for her plus a husband plus whatever kids they might have. Singleness gives us a freedom to be wholeheartedly living for Jesus, a freedom to be wholeheartedly serving Jesus. Often there's a simplicity to singleness that's just not there for the married person. And so God invites us to look at singleness from a different angle. Too often we see singleness as a lonely curse to escape from. We see singleness as a prison, and we spend all our time plotting and planning, how am I going to bust out of jail? How am I going to enjoy life on the other side? God invites us to see it as an extraordinary opportunity to be wholeheartedly living for him, serving him, serving his people. And along the way, God holds out the hope and the promise that there will be profound relationships that we'll discover along the way. The Apostle Paul talks about Timothy and Titus as his true children in the faith. The kind of friendship, the kind of fellowship, the kind of deep and meaningful relationship that we're able to find outside marriage. Singleness reminds us that we're most loved in Jesus and his people. Singleness invites us to see that all of life is about Jesus, and all of life is about serving Jesus. All of life is about being loved by him and giving our life for his glory. If that's what all of life is about, then there's no sense that singleness is missing out. Loved by God, freed to serve him, that's the single life that God offers us. Amen.